Hey budgies and wedgies, and welcome back to the channel. Now for those of you that have been following my YouTube channel for a while, you'll know that I really do love to experiment with foods. Currently I'm actually feeding my fish a mix of pellet foods along with frozen foods, and I've recently started to supplement fresh foods. And it doesn't get as fresher than the food actually being alive. And live foods tends to be a term that's thrown around a little bit too loosely. And yes, there are definitely downsides to feeding certain types of live foods, like feed a goldfish for example, but at the same time you can get a lot of benefits by feeding other kinds of live foods like Daphnia, and that's what we're going to have a look at in today's video and sort of explore the topic of feeding live foods and some of the benefits that you can actually get from doing this for your fish. But before we go ahead and get into this video though, as always, let's acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the people that are managing our land as well. Now to go ahead and help me out in this video, the amazing team at aquaticlivefood.com were kind enough to send me their packet of live Daphnia, and I actually have purchased other live food starter cultures from their website in the past before, so there is no financial incentive behind this. The live Daphnia was mainly just a tool for me to go ahead and talk to you about feeding invertebrate based live foods, but let's actually now have a look at some of the benefits that you can get. The first one I wanted to talk about is safety of feeding. The really great thing about feeding invert-based live foods like Daphnia, black worms, grindle worms, white worms, banana worms, you name it, is that they don't actually have the risk of carrying potential fish-borne diseases that you can get through feeding live feeder fish. If you take something like a live feeder goldfish or a feeder guppy, these are fish that can have a high risk of carrying diseases. The main reason is because they have a really high turnover rate, but at the same time they're not exactly kept in the best conditions, and because of this they can easily carry things like ick or internal parasites, and when you're passing that on to your fish through as a food source, it can very easily be transmitted over to your display aquarium, which I'm pretty sure is something that you don't want to go through. The really great thing about invert-based foods is they don't go ahead and carry this risk, but at the same time you can culture them, meaning that you can actually have a really high turnover rate of these foods yourself without the worry of going to an aquarium store, buying a bunch of live feeder fish, setting up an aquarium to go ahead and maintain them the same way that you'd maintain a display tank, and there's just a whole flow-on effect there. The other great thing is because you have that high turnover rate, you can basically have 2 or 3 cultures going, meaning that you can have a daily harvest to go ahead and feed to your fish. This then brings us onto our second benefit, and that is the long-term economical value of culturing live foods. When you're dealing with something like pellets, this container is going to get pretty empty pretty fast depending on how often you feed pellets, and that means you have to buy a new container, that'll get empty, buy another one, that'll get empty, but you don't run into that sort of issue with live foods, because you can basically have a culture running indefinitely, and in my opinion, the effort and the cost that's required to maintain a culture far outweighs the initial investment that you put into buying a new culture or the equipment required to have a long-term culture going. For something like Daphnia, all I really need to feed them is just a culture of phytoplankton. That's something that we talked about in a video that we did about 2 weeks ago, I believe, but that's actually a really cheap food to go ahead and grow. All I have is just a tub of fresh water with the phytoplankton culture. I don't give them any additional nutrients except for light. So for something that is just using the residual light coming off my aquariums that I'm then feeding onto Daphnia, which again is just a very cheap and easy food source for me to grow, that I can then feed to my fish for extremely high nutritional value, that is a major win in my views. And this leads us onto our next factor, which is the nutritional value. With live foods, they are obviously alive, meaning that the nutrients in them are still fresh at the source. You don't have to worry about the nutritional value of these fish potentially degrading when it goes through any extreme manufacturing process. Obviously with certain pellet foods you can probably get a higher nutritional output, but at the same time the enjoyment and also the flow-on effects of feeding live food in my opinion are quite good. Obviously I'm still using pellets as my primary food source, but these pellets will probably contain something like Daphnia or blackworms as a key ingredient. And when you're feeding this directly from its source, it isn't going through any intense manufacturing processes where it's being exposed to incredible heat, or if it's being frozen and then de-thawed and frozen again. When you go ahead and feed your fish, there's obviously some nutritional loss that happens there. And that's something that I don't have to go ahead and deal with when I'm feeding live foods. All I have to do is basically just open up this cap, pour it into my aquarium, and I've got little Daphnia swimming around that my fish can eat at their own pleasure. The really great thing, especially when you look at something like Daphnia, is that it grows in a freshwater environment, meaning that I could probably add a more than healthy amount of Daphnia into my freshwater tanks, and the fish can probably just pick at them at their own leisure throughout the course of a day or two, which is great if you need to go on like a holiday trip, for example, where you just dump in a boatload of Daphnia. The fish will just eat them at their own time, and it gives you a little bit of peace of mind because this Daphnia can survive long term in a freshwater environment. Heck, I probably think if I was to have a little refugium type setup in my inbuilt sump where there's just a boatload of Java moss and I add a bunch of Daphnia in, I could probably have Daphnia growing in my inbuilt sump that will probably occasionally get picked up by the return filter and just added back into the display tank. This is a concept that you see quite commonly used in a saltwater environment where they have refugiums, and that's something that you could achieve quite easily with something like live Daphnia. You can also feed your fish live blackworms, which are also available on the Aquatic Life Foods website, and the really great thing is live blackworms live in your substrate. So if you've got substrate feeders like Geophagus or Corydoras, for example, they can be a really great enrichment way to go ahead and get foods delivered to these fish, and especially if you've got top dwelling fish like giant danios, which could outcompete the foods that you're adding into your aquarium. For something like Corydoras, live blackworms would be a great indefinite, I guess, sort of way of ensuring that there is at least some method of food that's being delivered to those fish. So all in all, I can definitely recommend to have at least 1 or 2 types of live foods in your fish food arsenal because it's something that I do personally for my fish. It can get pretty pricey to go ahead and feed a good quality pellet food about 7 days a week. So this way, by having live foods, if this does ever run out, you've got something to fall back on. But at the same time, this can only be fed maybe about 3 to 4 times a week. And the rest of the days, you can give your fish a bit of a treat and some variation in their diet by feeding a good quality, nutritious live food. And if you were looking at potentially where you could go ahead and get a culture of live foods, look no further than aquaticlivefood.com. All of the different live food options that I've mentioned in this video can be found on their website, and you have the equipment necessary to go ahead and culture these foods as well, which is really easy to go ahead and do. Also, if you use the code BODGY15, you can actually get 15% off store-wide, so not only on live food cultures, but anything else that you find fancy on their shop, and that's a really great way if you are looking at getting multiple different cultures to go ahead and save a few bucks. But that's essentially it with this video. If you enjoyed it and you wanted to see more feeding videos like this, make sure you let me know in the comment section down below, and if you enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up as well. But as always, stay happy, stay safe, stay Aussie Australian. Bodgy out.